If there is a god, he has no power this far north. And in his absence, something sinister filled a vacuum of power. In the south, you choose which deity you follow and which sermons you partake in. In the north, you are forced to bow down, not by people, but by something which was never fully comprehended. What do the Inuits, the Evans, the Sami and the Yakut have in common? All of them live close to or inside the Arctic Circle. All of them are traditionally hunters, herders or fishermen. And all of them were victims to the most unusual disease. This illness has many symptoms: screaming, dancing, seeing demons, and causing harm to others as well as to oneself. For whatever reason, once the far north started developing during the 20th century, this sporadic madness faded into the background, becoming an increasingly rare occurrence. But there are too many recorded cases across too many countries to doubt its existence. It goes by many names: Anadyrskaya bol, Piblokto and меряченье, among others. All of them are collectively known as Arctic Hysteria. This is not the usual video going over something creepy and giving you a rational explanation at the end. Truth is, based on all the different theories I've read, there is no consensus as to what causes Arctic hysteria. I will start by going over some scientific theories and explain why most of them fail. But eventually, the video will move towards more esoteric views on the matter. I hate to admit that, in this specific case, they are actually worth considering. The affected howls, cries, talks nonsense, laments, often gets cramps, throws himself from corner to corner until exhausted he falls asleep. When in this fit, the afflicted can be made to do almost anything by imitation. Golovachev, Moscow University, 1902. Arctic hysteria, more commonly known as меряченье in Russia, has been documented by Russian explorers as far back as 1833 and lived in the oral tradition of native Siberians way before that. Prior to industrialization, it was an almost omnipresent phenomenon, common in the Samoyedic, Tungusic, Turkic and other Siberian ethnic groups. There is an article from 1926 Soviet Union that puts the severity of Arctic hysteria in very plain words. Northern Siberia was facing an extinction. A slow, silent death loomed over the snowy tundra. Life this far north has never been easy. A few too many bad hunting trips and the entire family faces a famine. The early 20th century proved to be especially cruel. Between the Great War, the bad harvest, the Civil War, desperate economic reforms and collapses of supply chains, it appears strange that Professor Anuchina highlights a different danger. The author goes against the notion that this is a matter of endangered tribes. That's an underestimate. The Russians living in these lands are experiencing the exact same decline. And even if the hygienic, administrative and cultural problems are solved, the region will die out anyway, unless it addresses Arctic hysteria. Every village and settlement seem to have at least one patient who'd experience these hysterical episodes frequently. The author is particularly fascinated by the imitation aspect of the disease. The afflicted often repeat what they hear, no matter who speaks. The most unsettling event described is with no doubt a case of mass imitation. This took place at one of the first anti-Tsarist rallies in the far north. The local hunters weren't political, so it surprised the speaker when the entire gathering suddenly started repeating his words. "Down with the Tsar's dictatorship! Down with the Tsar's dictatorship!" He continues. If an enemy of the people, he is taken aback by the interruption. Stands in our way. Realizing that with no incentive, the crowd started repeating his words, he asks, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" The crowd responds. The mental state of the northerners worries the researcher. The Russian settlers are prone to hour-long episodes of speech impediment problems, which make them hard to understand. A significant percentage of both natives and Russians seems to suffer from epilepsy. But Arctic hysteria, in its purest form, is especially terrifying. The victim starts laughing, then squealing and finally screaming from pain. They gradually lose consciousness, but the screams continue, and their body bends into unnatural positions. The worries about northern extinction turned out to be unnecessary. Somehow, Arctic hysteria slowly disappeared and northern Russia became home to the largest settlements in the Arctic Circle. Before we get to why that is, it's worth looking at documented cases elsewhere in the world. In the West, a new trend emerged in recent years. A trend to claim that Arctic hysteria has either never existed or that it's purely a colonial construct. In part, this started thanks to the work of a half-Inuit artist named Pia Arke. Her short performance, called Arctic Hysteria, sees her crawl naked across the map of Greenland and reenact the so-called Piblokto. Piblokto is the name for Arctic hysteria in territories, at the time, colonized by Britain and Denmark. The Europeans first learned of the phenomenon when they documented Inuit women suffering episodes of madness, often followed by a seizure. It doesn't fly well in today's age because some scholars classified it as a culture-bound syndrome. That is, a mental disease exclusive to a specific cultural group. Truth is, Piblokto is not a quote-unquote Inuit-only problem. Today, this claim mostly serves as a strawman argument. European sailors experienced the same symptoms. Whenever someone claims that it was an Inuit reaction to colonialism, they choose to fall into, among other things, one of the most prevalent tropes in Western academia. That is, ignoring the rest of the world. We already went over its prevalence in Russia among both native and settler populations, but cases have been reported in Canada and Alaska as well. Furthermore, there is nothing patriarchal about stating that this is an overwhelmingly female phenomenon. In the northern cultures traditionally dominated by hunting and fishing, the lifestyle differences between men and women are stark, which very well might explain why women are the primary victims of said disease. Yes, the term hysteria is outdated, so a different name for the illness might be warranted. That doesn't change that it's a real thing. There are small differences in the accounts of Piblokto and merяченье. While both report screaming, hysteria, violent outbursts and loss of consciousness, I struggled to find examples of an Inuit falling into the previously mentioned imitating behavior. It affects both adult men and adult women. Victims of Piblokto are not ostracized by the Inuits. A family member tends to watch from nearby, while the afflicted person goes through the episode. So what causes Arctic hysteria? Let us first establish what we know. Arctic hysteria was mostly prevalent in northern regions before industrialization. The southernmost recorded cases would be those among the Ainu living in Sakhalin, far below the Arctic Circle. But in general, the further north you go, the more common it becomes. Some authors, such as Novakovsky, present the argument that it's not latitude which determines how widespread the condition becomes, but rather the temperature. That would explain why the Yakut people seem to be especially vulnerable, with winters casually reaching -40 degrees Celsius. Or the Okhotsk coastal region, which is abnormally cold thanks to the winds coming from the sea. Others find latitude to be a more important factor than temperature. They argue that the long days and the long nights are especially stressful. December tends to be full of Arctic hysteria, as it's the darkest time of the year. Back in the day, the only way to survive in most corners of the Arctic was either hunting, fishing, or herding. Hunting and to a lesser extent fishing are heavily reliant on luck. While in some cultures the women helped with fishing to an extent, as a general rule the men went to hunt or fish and the women stayed at the camp. Imagine being the woman who stays. If the man doesn't return, that's very likely it for you and your kids. If the man returns empty-handed multiple times in a row, you will starve. The Arctic is a uniquely stressful environment. However, those who made their living by herding were also affected. Furthermore, the constant threat of starvation isn't unique to Arctic cultures. For example, desert hunter-gatherer tribes also live with this never-ending uncertainty. Other psychological explanations include strict rules in this or that society. For instance, the Inuits had large expectations placed on them based on an assigned role in their tribe. Once again, this fails to connect all the cases of Arctic hysteria together and isn't unique to the region. Before anyone asks, the illness is not caused by substance abuse. Alcohol came to the north with the Europeans. In Russia, the hunters were usually able to only get access to liquor during approximately a 3-month-long period when the weather allowed them to trade. It's true that the Russian settlers that arrived in Siberia used various mushrooms whenever alcohol was scarce. But this was not something repeated by the natives. The Yakut and other groups were reportedly suffering from intolerance towards fungi, and therefore left the magical mushroom drinks to the Slavs. To me, the dietary theories seem to be the most probable. In 1960, it was proposed that the Arctic populations suffer from a calcium deficiency, which, combined with the lack of sunlight, brings on a hysteric episode. A more likely cause observed both in the West and in Russia is overconsumption of fat and liver, both rich in vitamin A. This leads to hypervitaminosis A. European explorers of the Arctic often complained about getting sick from eating organs of polar bears. The Inuit were much better educated in this regard and avoided livers and hearts of sad animals. Even then, the abundance of fish and seal makes the Inuit diet perhaps the richest in vitamin A in the entire world. This is as far as science can go. Perhaps all of the factors mentioned create the perfect recipe for Arctic hysteria. Thanks to the stressful environment, dietary habits and daylight patterns, there is a solid case to be made for the cause of the disease. Thanks to development in the region, some of these problems have been fixed. Namely, there is now access to food from the south, which creates a more balanced diet. There are also more job opportunities and social safety nets. None of the theories mentioned are sufficiently tested, so it might be time to look at the native interpretations in order to see if anything else might have driven the far northerners mad. In 1870, a Cossack from Nizhnekolymsk in the far north of Siberia reported that around 70 people in his host suffered from a strange illness. It mostly manifests at night. They sing in various languages, hard to understand, every day from evening until midnight. It takes one to start singing, but as soon as he does, the other afflicted join. Their families seem worried, but don't intervene. They just watch them from the sidelines. Other accounts from researchers document the more traditional outbursts of Arctic hysteria, as can be observed mostly in women. The victim reports seeing some sort of an evil entity, which the Russians interpreted as the devil. She then proceeds to scream, sing, bang her head against the wall, and tear out her hair. This can last for an hour or an entire day. The Yakut have a pretty clear explanation. It's a possession by an evil spirit. Unlike shamans that can command the spirits, Arctic hysteria is involuntary. There are many folktales shared about the victims of Arctic hysteria. According to the Yakut, the afflicted can predict the future and sing in unknown languages. The latter immediately made me think back to the report of the Cossack about the men and women that started singing in various languages, even though the community was most likely only bilingual. In the early 1920s, Alexander Barchenko was sent to investigate Arctic hysteria among the Sami in the Kola Peninsula. It was paid for by the Soviet government, but Barchenko wasn't able to get much out of the local shamans. Once back home, he happily shared his theory about an ancient civilization, but kept silent on Arctic hysteria. Some believe that his findings on said topic were included in his secret report. FSB claims that the paper was destroyed during 1941, but many believe that the Russian government simply doesn't want to declassify it. Even with all the European science, the Inuit still appear to know more. They are successful at predicting episodes of Arctic hysteria, so when it arrives, they aren't surprised. Accounts on their view on the disease vary. Some say that in Inuit cultures, Arctic hysteria is seen as a simple illness. However, I've also read that it's interpreted as a possession by an evil spirit, which would be interesting considering the similarity with the Yakut legends, even though both groups had no contact with each other and worshipped different deities. Well, perhaps there is a certain deity hiding in plain sight. Even in the 20s, it was believed that one of the strongest possible explanations for Arctic hysteria are the northern lights and the magnetosphere of Earth. Some Siberian shamans strongly prefer to engage in rituals under the aurora borealis. Cases have been observed by the Russians in which shamans predicted the northern lights as much as one day in advance. There is one theory that I see circulating quite a lot. I haven't found any real evidence to back it up, but it captivated me with its beauty. I've read about an alleged Evanik folktale, one in which entire villages get out of bed in the middle of the night. Without opening their eyelids or putting on clothes, the group heads into the tundra, towards the North Star. Once someone hears the call, they can't be woken up. Only death in the snow will stop them. I guess I like this one so much because evil celestial bodies are some of my favorite horror tropes. It doesn't take much to disprove this theory though. On the other side of the Arctic Circle, the Inuits don't put much emphasis on the North Star. In their languages, it's often called something along the lines of never moves. It's usable for navigation only by the southernmost tribes, mostly those living in Kivalliq and Quebec. The problem with Arctic hysteria is that almost no factor is shared by every group affected. The only thing we know for certain is that development and an adoption of a modern lifestyle reduces the risks. For example, it's difficult to call it Arctic when there are recorded cases below the Arctic Circle, as far south as Sakhalin. If it was a thing in Sakhalin, then why not in parts of Europe or Canada? Well, there is a certain similarity that I noticed in North America. Take this more as an input for your imagination, rather than a concrete argument. In some Algonquian cultures, sharing the same latitudes as Sakhalin, there is another quote-unquote culture-bound syndrome, Wendigo psychosis. And it shares a lot of similarities with what we went over. Namely, the natives also interpret it as an involuntary possession by an evil spirit. Wendigo psychosis is also a documented, albeit rare, phenomenon. In short, there seems to be an abundance of culture-bound syndromes in the northern latitudes, even below the Arctic Circle. Europe, excluding its northernmost regions, is an exception, because it's warmer than Sakhalin and Canada. Of course, there is a big difference in symptoms, but that could be explained by different mythologies unconsciously suggesting what a possession might look like. The patient of Arctic hysteria might identify his symptoms as an evil spirit taking hold of his body, and based on his culture, act as expected. To see if there really is any connection, I would have to make another video about Wendigo psychosis, a subject I have read little about so far. If you want to see that, make sure to subscribe. The more shitposty video format will return once I make the Red Shambhala video. Until then, take care.